Hello, I'm Chris Slisher, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel, an intelligent, lively discussion about astrology, art, and spiritual adventure. Timing is everything, and as the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed. Join me as I explore concepts that allow us to broaden our view of the world. You'll hear interesting topics, meet fascinating guests, and discover who you really are. Using the time-tested practices of astrology, you'll learn how to accept change as the great wheel of life turns. Astrology, art, and spiritual adventure on Turning of the Wheel TV with Chris Slisher. Hello, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel. My name is Chris Slisher, and you know this is a show about astrology. And today we're going to be discussing the signs, all the individual signs. There's 12 different signs in the astrological zodiac, and today we're going to be discussing Aquarius. Aquarius is the period of time if you're born between January 20th and February 18th. In that framework, you become an Aquarius. Now that may be depending upon where you're born. Obviously the climate's going to be different, but we'll talk about it as if you were born in that time frame. You are an Aquarius person and you have distinct characteristics. As I mentioned in the past, when a person is born at a place in time, they are sort of cast with a certain amount of characteristics. So Aquarians all have a certain kind of characteristics. They are the people who have a great deal of, obviously have Aquarian attributes, and those are very generally felt across anybody who's an Aquarius. You will see people, if you know any Aquariuses in your life, you will begin to see certain characteristics that begin to resonate amongst all these people. They share a certain quality. They have certain attributes that they espouse. They certain attributes that they sort of advertise or represent. And that's what you'll find with the Aquarius. Now the Aquarius is a fixed sign. A fixed sign is a sign which is sort of, it's just that, it does not move very well. It is a sign that is sort of permanently trenched in its sign and has a sense of duty bound to it and is sort of somewhat inflexible. It's an air sign. Many people think of Aquarius as a water sign, but it is not. That's probably because they get it confused with aquarium. But it's not a water sign, it is an air sign. So as an air sign, it is very much about the intellect. Air in astrology represents the intellect. It's the cerebral quality. It's the intellect, it's the curiosity, it's the researcher, it's the scientist, it's the person with the big views. It's all in the head. Different signs have different characteristics, but Aquarius and the other air signs, Gemini and Libra, all deal with this ability to be this cerebral quality. When you put two air signs in the same room, they will have a natural rapport. They will have this certain type of information that flows back and forth because it is all within the realm of the head. It's the brain. Earth signs have different characteristics, water signs do, and fire signs as well. We'll get to them further on. But the Aquarius is that fixed air sign. Now a fixed air sign is a person who has, and Aquarius as a rule, generally are very broad thinking people. They are very much, not very self-centered, they're very much focused on the greater good of the world or the greater good of the community from which they are part of. The community is that realm of influence for which they are part of. And their emphasis, their goal, their mode of operation is outwardly bound and tends to be focused on the greater good of the people. Two of the most notable presidents we've had in this country were Aquarians. They were Aquarius, Franklin Roosevelt and Abraham Lincoln. They spent all of their time and energy, despite huge physical limitations with Roosevelt, and despite an enormous civil war with Abraham Lincoln. All of their time and energy was put into trying to solve these problems, these big, large global problems. They weren't working on small things. They weren't working on themselves so much as they were trying to resolve these bigger things. This is where you will find the Aquarius. You'll find the Aquarius in universities. You'll find them in publishing, any place where they can be influential on a larger scale. This is one of the greatest things about the Aquarius, is they have this great sort of long-range sweep of what the world looks like and how to solve that. They're very globally sort of, community organizers, community organizing people who work in social justice, who work in universities, who work in areas like that. This is where you're going to find these Aquarian people. They have a very, very strong affinity towards this. As we can see, Franklin Roosevelt spent all of his life working for the greater good of the country and took us through some of the most difficult times in American history. And he left his imprint, which is very real. We're still feeling the impact of his presence to this very day. Social Security, the draft, many different things were put in place by him. The WPA, the Works Progress Association, which put people to work at a time when there was no work. Got us through the Depression, got us into the, solved the problem of what to do with the World War and what sort of decisions to make. And so they're very critical when it comes to that kind of situations. And it's a very, it's a sort of a sign that has a certain seriousness to it. That's not to say that all Aquariuses are serious, but there's a certain underlying sense of responsibility and duty that they feel bound to administer in the course of their lives. It's a sort of thing that is they're sort of the deliverer of information. They're deliverer of knowledge. There's a real social cause there. They want to be known and they want to put their work into that outwards bound. Now, being a fixed sign means that they are sort of very fixed, literally fixed in their views. So that the thing is that a fixed sign typically, as a rule, is one who has an opinion and is very reluctant to vary from that opinion. So the opinion is very clear and crisp, and they're not about to change that. So as a result, they're very stubborn in some regard. They're sort of standoffish. They hold people in place. Their opinions are known, and it's unlikely that they're going to vary on that. Now, these are broad. Don't forget, astrology is always based on broad strokes, especially when I'm talking to a large group of people such as yourself. I can't get into the details of every Aquarius that you know. I've got to paint with a very broad brushstroke in order to get you to understand what Aquarius is all about. And I'll read some passages here to sort of help you get a better idea of it. But it's most important that you understand what it is that they bring to the table. They bring this, and you'll often find them in universities and hospitals, broadcasting, publishing, where their influence can be felt on a much larger, they got a lot of bang for their buck, so to speak. So they have this great sense of community, organizational, and it's always about the cerebral. It's that interesting quality. As a result of having that quality and being very outwardly focused, they're not very inwardly focused, and therefore sometimes they can come off as a little bit chilly sometimes, or a little bit standoffish, or hard to penetrate in some ways, because there's that sense of there's this sort of standoffishness, there's sort of this larger view of what's going on with the world, and their focus is outwardly bound, as I mentioned. That's why we see people like Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Delano Roosevelt fitting that category so well. I do want to read a few things here because I think it's important that you understand some of the key words that we use when we're talking about this. And this is a great book that I use all the time. One thing I want to say here, although Aquarius is an air sign, its true nature is sometimes misunderstood because it's depicted by a man carrying an urn of water. But that urn of water is meant to represent knowledge. It's a symbol for representing knowledge. In ancient times, when astrology was formulated, the concept of radiations and oscillatory impulses passing through the atmosphere and even through solid matter was impossible to convey graphically. So this is the idea of information being disseminated. That gives you a crisp idea of what's going on. The energy being dispelled around the people. This is an interesting spot. You wouldn't see this any other place but in the dispersion of information. This is not all signs have this. This is a very unique Aquarian kind of thing. We hear about the age of Aquarius. That was a time and place when we had people who were very focused and on different characteristics. But what we want to know primarily is where this person resides. How does this person fit in with the realm, and who would they do well with? Now, as an air sign always does well with either another air sign or a fire sign, because fire feeds air, air feeds fire. You can't have fire and water together. You can't have fire and earth together. They're not complementary. But fire and air do work together as a harmonious kind of mixture. You can't have one without the other, as I mentioned. Another thing I want to talk to you about is that Aquarius represents the circulatory system, which makes sense. If you think of the circulatory system as a sort of our electrical makeup, that's a very much of an Aquarian kind of quality. It has that sense of spark, that sense of innovation, that sense of motion. And matter of fact, that all makes sense when you think about the planet that rules the sign of Aquarius, which is Uranus. And Uranus is very much of that kind of forward-thinking, innovative, inventive, sparky kind of electrical kind of energy that you feel. This is where we find the most relevance when it comes to the type of quality we're talking about when it comes to Aquarius. Aquarius has that energy. It's about the connection. It's about, if you think of the circulatory system as a giant grid work, like an electrical grid work, that mode and that idea fits very clearly in that regard. We think about it in terms of, connection. The internet, the web, is very much of an Aquarian kind of construct. And it came into light back in 1993 when Uranus was in Aquarius, the sign that it ruled. So this spark, this blast of information, this major, huge paradigm shift with regard to the way people communicate came to light when Uranus was in Aquarius at that moment, the sign that it rules. Now Uranus is in Aries, and we're seeing the fruits of that innovation coming about. Uranus is all about innovation. It's about rebellion. It's about starting new. It's about being, forward thinking. It's about that sense of philosophy. It's about progress and moving forward. How do we move forward with that? And it's very, very important to understand that there's this real sense of community is a very key word, but also about the intellect. The intellect is a very key part of what it means to be an Aquarius. Aquarius spends a great deal of time, and as I said, these are generalizations. They spend a great deal of time in that realm of outside thought, deep thought. What does it take to do this? How does it take to work? And that's why you'll find people in positions of leadership. These are people who spend a lot of their time helping others. Oftentimes you'll find people who are very altruistic there because their focus is outwardly bound. But they're deep thinkers. They really are the people who do a lot of the planning. And it's, you find great city planners. Politicians are very prominent as Aquariuses, especially the ones that I mentioned. And when we have that, we have that fixity. That fixity, what fixity, meaning that it's a fixed sign, what that brings to a character is a sense of determination. Determination is the singular will to get something done. A person is determined to get something done. They will work doggedly to do that, which is what you would find with a fixed sign. A fixed sign is one that is going to see its charter and plod towards that motion, never varying. Loyal, confident, intellectual, cerebral, very much of a thinker, big long-term, long-range thinker who has an idea where society needs to go. When you see it in an individual's chart, when the sun is in Aquarius and they're born in that time frame, you can see a dramatic difference in the individual and who they are. However, if the rising sign of an individual is in Aquarius, we also see that same quality come to light. We see that strong characteristic come to light. We'll see that leadership, and we'll see that sort of aloofness. And I'm going to give you an example of some people that I know of off the top of my head. When we have Aquarius in the first house, if you have Aquarius rising, that would be a person who would make a fantastic politician, but one who's perhaps difficult to get to know. Someone like a Bill Clinton's a great politician, but he's somebody who's likely to get to know. He's very, charismatic and open and in your face, and very much he fills the room up, for example. But when we come to someone like Barack Obama, who has Aquarius rising, we see a person who's a little bit difficult to get through. He's been criticized for being a little standoffish, a little bit harder to get to know, a little bit more reserved. He's not quite as effusive with his emotions. This is very much of a typical, but he does represent his main purpose is the greater good of all. And that's where we find his greatest quality. That's where we see Aquarius rising. As I've mentioned in other segments, the rising sign of a chart, and if you're not sure, you should go to my website and you can see the other segments there and read and watch the one on the rising sign. The rising sign is one of the single most important characteristics of the individual. It's based on the time of birth. When you have that as your rising sign, you are going to express yourself with that kind of quality going outward. And you'll find people who get along with have that same characteristic. When we see Aquarius in the second house, we see somebody who may very well be working in charities or dealing with money, large amounts of money, fostering the work of perhaps a mutual fund, someone who's working with investing money on a very large scope for the greater good. You know, a charitable foundation would be a great place to find someone there. Or somebody who has a much broader view. You see the same kind of theme comes forward. That broad view, that long-reaching view of what it means to be and what it is, opposed to being stuck in minutia like some other signs we'll get to later on. Aquarius in the third sign is the person who's in publishing. He's the writer. He's the person who creates the blogs or is the newscaster whose voice speaks for many. You know, we might see someone like a Walter Cronkite. I don't know that for a fact, but I wouldn't be surprised if he didn't have a strong placement of Aquarius in his chart. This is where we'll find the person who has that sense of being able to communicate and get his message across to large quantities and groups of people, or uses that to his best interests. Aquarius in the fourth house would be, or Aquarius, in the fourth house would be a person who had the ability to be more focused on the home and the domestic machinations of the family. And this might be where you'd find somebody whose home life is good, is comfortable, it's kind, it's all that, but it might be something a little bit chilly there. They may be a little bit detached in some way. When we find Aquarius in the fifth house, we see somebody who's incredibly creative with their global reach. This might be an artist who's able to, leave an impression across a large swath of society, and his influence is very largely felt in those regards. This is an interesting area for that to happen. Aquarius in the sixth house is where you might find someone who has the ability to use on their daily basis, use their impact to impact people. Matter of fact, that's where my Aquarius is in my sixth house, and it gives me the ability to reach out to you in this format where I'm able to be a messenger of sorts to get information out to other people and to carry it forward. Aquarius in the seventh house might be the relationship. That's the relationship house, as you know, and the relationship house is one that's critical for maintaining balance and having continuity amongst relationships. You must have continuity amongst relationships in order for them to work. So you have to have that. They may not be the warmest, most affectionate people if they're in the seventh house, if they have Aquarius in the seventh house, but you will see, and of course it depends upon the planets there as well, because there will be a formula, a story that gets brought out of that combination of things. Everything in astrology is about a story. This is the great story. It's a matter of which story you take on. Each story is there based on the characters and the placement of the houses and the charts and the planets in those houses, in those signs, that gives the story. And that is where the individual particular astrology chart of you, the individual, is critical to know, because your chart is different than everybody else's. If you want information about how to do that, contact me at my website, turningatthewheel.com. And when I speak with you and I look at your chart, without knowing anything about you, I look at your chart, I can tell exactly what's going on and why things are happening the way they are, and certain characteristics, and why relationships work and why they don't work, why you're successful in some areas and you're not successful in others. These are critical pieces that the astrology chart can bring to you. Very, very relevant. When we move to Aquarius in the eighth house, we see a very deeply spiritual person. This might be a person who works in a large religious organization or some sort of a spiritual organization, or also deals with the concept of death and that whole form of transition. What does transition look like? It's the time of going from one to the next. That transition is a very critical piece. We know what that's all about. We've talked about that in other segments before. When we look at Aquarius in the ninth house, we see the educator, we see the traveler, we see the person putting a lot of time and effort into teaching those large, broad topics that I spoke of earlier. This is an area where you see a deep influence transitioning across large quantities. This is where you'll see the university professors. This is where you'll see the administrators. Sometimes you may even see the travel people who are there. The great spiritual thinkers, the travelers, the deeply spiritual people are found with Aquarius in the ninth house as a very critical piece. When we come to Aquarius in the 10th house, we see the person who uses this skill, this large, organizational, far-reaching, not introverted, extroverted kind of skill set to manifest through their job. This is where you'd find somebody who's very good with details, very good as a leader, interesting, and is always thinking down the road further. This is where you're going to find this person always thinking down the road further, where there'll be this great sense of forward thinking. How do we move forward? Where do we become innovative? Where do we find ourselves doing things differently? Trying out new projects, new products, but also typically within large organizations. This is a great place to find them. When we see Aquarius in the 11th house, we see their influence being felt in some ways the place where they belong the most, which is the 11th house, which is ruled by Aquarius, is the 11th sign. We see things come into play where they're working within groups. And when they're working within groups, they're quite effective as leaders and visionaries. This is where we see a lot of spiritual people. They have a real sense of vision, a real sense of the much bigger picture. I keep coming back to that phrase, the larger picture. This is where we see people. We see them in that great sense of innovation. That's Uranus. The sense of the cerebral quality, the intellectual quality. When I say cerebral, I mean people who spend a lot of time thinking. This is where this is their realm. They're sort of lost in that part of time where they spend a great deal of time thinking about how to make things better for the world. They're almost singularly driven. And you think about it, we need that person in the zodiac because not everybody is that way. Aries are very single-minded and they're all about themselves. You know, Tauruses are much more about being sometimes lazy or having a good time or living the good life. Geminis have their own characteristics. But Aquarius, as a sign, is a fixed air sign. And in that I say, again, there's that sense of looking a much larger view, sort of the 10,000-foot view. They're way up in that, looking down and saying, how can I have an impact on this planet? What can I do? Where do I fit in this whole picture? And this is a great sense of being able to comply, and their role is very valuable, very valuable. They are a necessary part of the pie, just as every sign is important. But they're important for different reasons, and that's a very important piece. So then when we move on to the 12th house, we see Aquarius in the 12th house. We would look at the house of transition. These are people who might be great thinkers and trying to move things forward. There's this great sense of having a visionary, sometimes we might have a visionary who's there, a very strong sense of, you know, this lofty look out at the world, trying to cast a great pioneer. Not everybody has this ability. When we look over history and we look at the great names and we look at what their signs are and we do a study of this, we can see that there's a lot of stuff going on there, and it all makes sense, especially someone like Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln gave up his whole life to try to keep, literally, to try to keep the Union in place in the Civil War. All of his time was spent working on that. His view was very large. He was not one who spent his time worrying about the garden or what was going on in the daily life. His view was always about how to make this country heal, how to work this problem. He's a natural person for the times. That's why he's so monumental. That's why he's so profound of a historical figure. He was there at the right place in the right time. Or, you could argue, he was there by divine intervention, which brings him to a spot in time where he had to be there for the times. No other man could have done that had it not been for him having that singularness of ideas. He's a legal background, very methodical in his thinking, very analytical in his thinking, and was able to do that. You see many of the same characteristics in Franklin Delano Roosevelt, also faced with personal hardship. But neither of those two presidents that I mentioned had very good relationships with their wives or their home lives. They were very aloof and sort of removed because their focus was so drawn to this outside. That's why sometimes people think of them as chilly. Now, if you're an air sign, if you're a Gemini and a Libra and you got a friend who's an Aquarius, you probably get along fine. The same is true for the fire signs, Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius. When they have an Aquarius friend, they probably get along fine. But if you had to stop and do an analysis of that person, you probably would come to the conclusion that yes, they may be a little bit more aloof, a little more removed, because it's not something personal, and it's not a judgment, and it's not a casting of anything. It is simply an observation of what astrology is all about and how it works. When someone is born as an Aquarius, they're going to have these kind of thoughts. Now, the Aquarius who's in transition in the 12th house will deal with those major themes of life and death. What does that look like to go through the life and death process? How do we get through the transition? How do we become pioneers? Transition, again, as I mentioned before, is about being a pioneer, getting through things, becoming that person. It's the bearer of intelligence. It's the water bearer. It's the bearer, and water is seen as symbolically as the great equalizer. It's the thing that brings about intelligence and that great equalizer that joins all men together. We are arising from water. I do want to read a few more things here just to give you an idea of some other key words that we can talk about. The true Aquarian is a universalist. I love that. That's just a perfect phrase, a universalist. and in that as indifferent to social distinctions and prejudices as radio waves are to buildings. That's a critical piece. As indifferent to personal relationships and associations. They're a universalist in that they are willing to work for the universal good of all, but they're not worried about the minutiae, the social interconnections. So sometimes an Aquarius might be a little bit socially awkward sometimes, or drawn into that area. And the same would be true for an Aquarius rising, or anybody who, or an Aquarius moon as well. An Aquarius person with an Aquarius moon in Aquarius might have a certain emotional reservedness, I guess is what I would say. Reserved. They're reserved, and their goals and actions and functions are all on that greater sort of plane of influence, and how that plane of influence works towards people and what they can do with it. It's a very critical piece. I love that. Is the universalist. It's exactly the right phrase for that. And when we take someone who's got a universal approach, they're not worried about the light switches. They're not worried about the electric bill. They're not worried about, you know, sort of the mundane characteristics of the day-to-day life. They're thinking much longer, much further out. There's this really overarching theme about religion and philosophy and politics and deep subjects, and even science, very much so. Science or anything technical. There's that real strong technical. But they tend to be very innovative people, really innovative and sort of, you know, progressives. They're progressive. They're universally progressive. This is where we see people who put down major initiatives to get society into a better place. It's a time of the year where the things are chilly. We see that in the northern hemisphere, and of course in the southern hemisphere it's just the opposite. But being born an Aquarius, just like I've mentioned to you at any time, being born in any sign, any time, when we are born at those times, just as Carl Jung, the famous psychologist, said, we are imbued at a point in time, much the way a grape is on a vine. The water, the temperature, the light, the terroir, the soil, all of those variables may change each year, each day, because the sun may come up tomorrow, the sun may not be up the next day. It may rain tomorrow, it may not rain tomorrow. Being born on that day with those kind of characteristics as your overarching theme set in place the character of the personality. So this is what's critical. Carl Jung, no slouch, very well-known psychologist. And he saw astrology as the basis for the personality and the formation of the personality and the attributes that you can assign to a personality. Granted, they are broad brushes that we stroke with, we use to paint. Broad brush strokes, meaning that the influence is going to be felt across a large amount of people, and they should be seen as large characteristics. But in that realm comes the individual, and you can recognize that person. And why is it so important? Because it helps you understand who you are, where you're going, what your talents are, who you should be with, and where you are supposed to go in your life. This is what astrology can really teach you. You can be skeptical. Let me have a talk with you. I'll show you where you go. If you're an Aquarius, I can tell you your attributes and your weaknesses, your strengths and weaknesses. We're all a composite of strengths and weaknesses. As I mentioned before, we're dualistics. And that's the point of it all. I encourage you to get your chart done. This is a very important piece of who you are, and you'd be amazed, especially for newborns, how much there is there for the individual to learn, and how much you know you can help the person along their way. Your real true purpose is imbued in that logical quality of that astrology chart. Being born at a place and time puts you in a spot where your life and your destiny are clearly there. Your purpose is there. Contact me, turningofthewheel.com and turningofthewheel.tv are my websites, and you can find me there, and I look forward to hearing from you. Take care.